The hum of the fluorescent lights above Reid's desk was a constant, low thrum, a monotonous counterpoint to the rhythmic clicking of keyboards around him. He stared at the spreadsheet, rows of data blurring into an uninspired grid. Another Tuesday, another stack of invoices to reconcile. His life, he often thought, was a series of predictable, interlocking gears, each rotation indistinguishable from the last. Determination, a quality he cultivated like a hardy perennial, was what kept him from succumbing to the creeping ennui. He found satisfaction and order, in the precise alignment of numbers, in the quiet predictability of his days. Then the phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, a regional code he didn't recognize. He answered with a practiced, neutral greeting. On the other end, a crisp, formal voice introduced himself as a solicitor, speaking of an estate, a distant relative, a sudden passing. Reid listened, his brow furrowing. A great-aunt, twice removed, he gathered, whose name, Elara Vance, sparked only the faintest echo of a memory, perhaps from a yellowed family tree his grandmother had once shown him. He recalled a faded photograph, a stern-faced woman with eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets, but little more. He hadn't seen her, perhaps, since he was a child, and even then, only briefly. The solicitor's voice continued, outlining the unexpected bequest, a cabin. Secluded, ancient, deep within a forgotten forest. Reid's first thought was of a quaint, rustic retreat, a place for quiet weekends. His second, a prickle of unease, was about the sudden, mysterious death mentioned so casually. The solicitor offered no details, only a polite, firm insistence that Reid should visit the property to understand its scope. He was the sole heir. The words hung in the air, a peculiar weight. The decision to go was not immediate, but it felt inevitable. The gears of his life, for the first time in years, had jammed. A cabin, a mystery, a break from the relentless hum. Perhaps it was a chance to impose order on something new, something untamed. He arranged for a week of leave, packed a single duffel bag with essentials, and set out. The journey began predictably enough, the familiar sprawl of the city gradually giving way to manicured suburbs, then to rolling farmland. But as the miles accumulated, the landscape grew wilder, the roads narrower. The asphalt cracked and frayed at the edges, replaced eventually by gravel, then by a dirt track barely wide enough for his sedan. The tree-line thickened, pines pressing in on either side, their boughs heavy with shadows even in the afternoon sun. The air grew cooler, carrying the damp scent of loam and decaying leaves. The silence that settled over the car was profound, broken only by the crunch of tires on loose stones and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. He drove for hours, following the solicitor's vague, hand-drawn map, until the track opened into a small, desolate clearing. Perched on a low rise, silhouetted against a bruised sky, stood an abandoned weather station. Its skeletal frame of rusted metal scaffolding reached skyward, a forgotten monument to some past scientific endeavor. A wind vane, seized by rust, pointed perpetually north, a silent sentinel. The glass in its single, grimy window was long gone, leaving a gaping maw that seemed to stare blankly at the encroaching forest. The structure itself was a patchwork of corroded panels and peeling paint, leaning precariously as if weary from years of battling the elements. No signs of life, no fresh tracks, just the deep, undisturbed quiet. It was a stark, almost unsettling landmark, a definitive end to any pretense of civilization. This place was truly isolated. Beyond the weather station, the track narrowed further, almost swallowed by ferns and saplings. He pressed on, the car complaining with every jolt. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in streaks of bruised purple and orange. Then, through a sudden break in the dense canopy, he saw it. The cabin. It sat, hunched beneath a massive, ancient oak, its branches like gnarled fingers reaching towards the sky. The structure itself seemed to sag into the earth, a gray, weathered sentinel. A stone chimney, blackened with soot, rose crookedly from the roof. No porch light, no welcoming glow. Reid killed the engine. The sudden cessation of noise was jarring. He stepped out of the car, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, leaf-strewn ground. The forest pressed in, a wall of silent, watchful trees. This wasn't a quaint retreat. This was something else entirely. An unease, subtle but persistent, began to coil in his gut. He was here, at the edge of something unknown, and the predictable gears of his life had spun irrevocably off course. Another Tuesday, another stack of invoices to reconcile. His life, he'd realized with a sudden, chilling clarity, was a meticulously organized cage. The news of the distant relative's death, followed by the unexpected inheritance of the cabin, had felt less like a tragedy and more like a sudden, violent gust of wind ripping through his carefully constructed apathy. He hadn't known the man, not truly, but the cabin offered an escape, a raw, untamed possibility. He'd resigned the next day, packed his meager belongings into his sedan, and pointed the nose of the car towards the forgotten forest. The drive was long, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to little more than twin ruts carved into the earth, swallowed by encroaching ferns and moss. The forest pressed in, ancient and indifferent, its canopy a dense, unbroken ceiling that filtered the sunlight into dappled, shifting patterns. When the cabin finally appeared, it did so without fanfare, simply materializing at the end of the track, a hunched silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. It was older than he'd imagined, its timbers silvered by decades of rain and sun, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from under heavy brows of moss-laden eaves. A scent, earthy and damp, of pine needles and decaying leaves, hung heavy in the air, tinged with something else, something metallic and forgotten, like rust on old blood. Stepping inside, Reid was met by a profound chill that had nothing to do with the external temperature. The air was stagnant, thick with the smell of dust, aged wood, and a faint, cloying sweetness he couldn't place. Dust motes danced in the last slivers of light filtering through the grime-streaked panes. The floorboards groaned under his weight, a chorus of complaints from the very structure of the place. The cabin felt less like a house and more like a sleeping beast. He spent the first few days simply trying to make it habitable. He cleared away cobwebs thick as gauze, swept layers of grit from the wide plank floors, and scrubbed at the persistent grime on the windows. He lit a fire in the stone hearth, coaxing reluctant warmth into the frigid air. It started subtly. He'd be in the kitchen, wiping down a dusty counter, when he'd hear a distinct thud from upstairs. Not the settling of old wood, but a definite, singular impact. He'd pause, listening, but the sound wouldn't repeat. Just the house, he'd mutter, attributing it to the wind or the expansion and contraction of ancient timber. He'd rub his tired eyes, blaming the poor light and the strain of unpacking. One evening, he set his worn copy of a thriller novel on the small, scarred table beside the armchair, intending to read before bed. He'd gone to the kitchen for a glass of water, a simple, mundane task. When he returned, the book was no longer lying flat. It was open, face down, on the floor, its spine bent at an unnatural angle. He picked it up, a faint prickle of unease tracing its way up his spine. He was certain he'd placed it squarely on the table. He rationalized it away, of course. He must have nudged it, or perhaps the table itself wasn't perfectly level. He told himself he was tired, his mind playing tricks. But the rationalization felt thin, like a worn fabric stretched too taut. The next afternoon, a low, rhythmic scratching began behind the wall of the bedroom he'd chosen. It wasn't the frantic scurry of a mouse, but something slower, more deliberate, like nails dragging across a rough surface. He pressed his ear to the wall, holding his breath. The scratching stopped. He waited, listening to the frantic thrum of his own pulse. Then, it started again, fainter this time, as if whatever made the sound had moved deeper into the wall, or perhaps further down the corridor. This wasn't just the house settling. This was something else. He ran his hands along the rough-hewn walls, tapped at the floorboards, seeking an explanation, a hidden cavity, anything to dispel the growing unease. In what appeared to be a disused, tiny study off the main living area, crammed with dusty, empty shelves, he noticed a faint discoloration in the wallpaper near the floor. Peeling it back carefully, he found a small, almost invisible seam in the wooden paneling. With a grunt, he pried it open. He reached in, his fingers brushing against something stiff and brittle. He pulled it out, a heavy, leather-bound logbook, its cover warped and its pages yellowed with age. The title, etched in faded gold script, read, "Weather Station Observations." Beneath it, a date from over a century ago. Reid sat down heavily on the dusty floor, the book resting on his knees. This cabin, this relative he barely knew, had a weather station? He flipped open the cover. The handwriting inside was elegant but spidery, filled with precise meteorological data, barometric pressure, wind speed, temperature, precipitation. But as he turned the pages, the entries grew stranger. Interspersed with the weather data were cryptic notes, symbols he didn't recognize, and increasingly unsettling observations. August 14th, barometer steady. Wind from WNW. Temp 68F. He was observed unusual atmospheric luminescence above the western ridge after midnight. Faint, pulsing light, no discernible source. Flash flooding in Lower Creek bed. Logged a peculiar resonance in the air, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. The wildlife grew silent. No birdsong for 3 hours. October 21st, clear skies, crisp air. Temp 42F. The shadow moved again in the periphery of the weather station. Larger this time. Felt a pressure, a distinct presence. The compass needle spun wildly for several minutes, then settled north-northwest. It points to the burial mound. Reid's breath hitched. The burial mound? He glanced around the small, silent study, then back at the logbook. This wasn't just about the weather. The seed of doubt had blossomed into a thorny, unwelcome vine, tightening its grip around his chest. He was no longer alone in this cabin. The burial mound? This wasn't just about the weather. This was something else entirely. He was no longer alone in his unease. The cabin itself felt like a presence now, breathing down his neck. He closed the logbook, the thud echoing too loudly in the sudden stillness. He tried to dismiss it, to rationalize the entry as a local's quirky observation, perhaps a misinterpretation of some geological feature. But the rationalizations felt thin, transparent, crumbling under the weight of the cabin's oppressive atmosphere. Over the next few days, the cabin's peculiar manifestations intensified, shedding their last vestiges of deniability. The whispers became more distinct, though never clear enough to form words, like voices caught in a distant, static-laden broadcast. They seemed to emanate from the very walls, a low, sibilant murmur that frayed Reid's nerves. He found small objects, a ceramic mug, a set of keys, inexplicably relocated from where he'd left them, often to prominent, almost pointed positions, as if placed there to be found. A faint, cloying scent of damp earth and something sharply metallic would occasionally permeate the air, only to vanish as quickly as it arrived, leaving Reid to sniff the empty air like a hound, questioning his own senses. It danced for a moment, a silent, mocking jig, before dissolving back into the general gloom. Reid blinked, rubbed his eyes, and when he looked again, the corner was just a corner, innocuous and still. But the image was seared into his mind, an undeniable proof that his perception was not failing him, reality itself was fraying at the edges. He stopped trying to rationalize. The logical part of his mind, the part that dealt in concrete facts and observable phenomena, was screaming in protest, but the primal part, the one that responded to ancient, unspoken fears, knew a truth too terrible to ignore. He was not just living in an old house, he was living in a place that defied logic, a place that was alive with something he couldn't comprehend. He needed answers. The relative's small collection of books in the study offered little beyond dusty treatises on forestry and local fauna. But then, a memory surfaced, a passing mention in an old letter about the relative's interest in weather patterns, and a small, private structure built further into the woods, a weather station. It was a long shot, but if the logbook hinted at something beyond meteorology, perhaps more answers lay hidden there. The path to the weather station was overgrown, the undergrowth thick and grasping. The forest, usually a comforting presence, now seemed to press in on him, the ancient trees reaching skeletal branches overhead, blocking out the sky. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt through him. He felt watched, not by animals, but by something far older, far more discerning. After nearly an hour of pushing through tangled vines and low-hanging branches, he stumbled upon it. The weather station was a dilapidated shack, barely larger than a shed, nestled in a clearing that felt unnaturally still. Its paint peeled in ragged strips, and several windows were boarded up, one with a tattered tarp flapping mournfully in the non-existent breeze. A rusted anemometer on the roof was frozen mid-spin, a silent testament to its disuse. He pushed open the creaking door. The interior was a single, cramped room, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. A rickety wooden table dominated the space, covered in obsolete meteorological instruments, a barograph with a dried, brittle chart, a thermometer cracked down the middle, and a rain gauge filled with stagnant water. Reid's flashlight beam swept across the shelves lining the walls. Most held more weather-related texts, almanacs, and a few outdated atlases. But tucked away behind a stack of mildewed topographical maps, he found it, a small, leather-bound journal, its cover unmarked, its pages yellowed and brittle. It wasn't a weather log. The journal felt ancient, heavy with secrets. Back at the table, he carefully opened it. The handwriting was spidery, precise, and unmistakably the relative's. The initial entries were mundane, observations on local flora, musings on the changing seasons. But as Reid turned the pages, the tone shifted. The entries grew increasingly agitated, filled with references to the land's hunger and the cycle of dormancy. He found crude, unsettling sketches of what looked like the cabin's layout, but with strange symbols marked at specific points, radiating outwards from what was clearly the burial mound mentioned in the logbook. Then, he found the entry that made his breath catch. They spoke of a pact, generations ago. A promise to the forest, to the earth itself. They said it brought prosperity, but at what cost? The terms are vague, shrouded in fear, but the lineage. The lineage must uphold the bargain. They demand their due. The land stirs. A pact. A lineage. A debt. It wasn't just a burial ground, it was something far more deliberate, far more sinister. His relative hadn't just inherited the cabin, they had inherited an obligation, a terrible, ancient burden. And now, so had he. He closed the journal, his hands trembling. The air in the weather station suddenly felt thin, suffocating. He backed away, bumping against the table, sending a small, rusted compass clattering to the floor. Its needle spun wildly, settling not on north, but pointing resolutely towards the floorboards directly beneath the table. Reid didn't dare look. He just knew. He scrambled out of the shack, the journal clutched tight in his hand. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of frantic footsteps and panicked glances over his shoulder. The forest seemed to mock him, the rustling leaves sounding like derisive laughter. The seed of doubt had not just blossomed, it had taken root deep within him, intertwining with his very being, promising a harvest of unimaginable horror. A lineage. He stood frozen for a long moment, the spectral whispers fading, replaced by the frantic thrum of his own pulse against his eardrums. He wouldn't simply flee. He couldn't. This wasn't just a place, it was a trap, and he was already caught. Reid began to search. Not a casual rummage, but a methodical, almost frantic dissection of the cabin's secrets. He ran his hands along every panel of the rough-hewn walls, tapped on floorboards, examined the undersides of dusty furniture. He tried the drawers, finding them stiff but ultimately empty, save for a few desiccated insect husks and a faint smell of camphor. He knelt, peering underneath, running his hand along the bottom edge of the top drawer. There. A subtle lip, a slight misalignment. Inside, nestled in a bed of ancient, crumbling velvet, lay a single, leather-bound journal. Its cover was mottled with mildew, the leather dry and cracked like sun-baked earth. A thin, brittle ribbon marked a page deep within. The scent of old paper and something else, something metallic and faint, rose from its pages as Reid carefully lifted it out. His hands trembled. This was it. This was the tangible evidence he'd craved. He carried it to the small, grimy window, needing the meager daylight to penetrate the gloom. The first few pages detailed mundane observations, weather patterns, notes on forest growth, repairs to the cabin. The handwriting, elegant but spidery, belonged to a woman, likely the relative who had last occupied the cabin. But as Reid flipped to the marked page, the tone shifted. The script became hurried, agitated, the ink smudged in places as if written with a shaking hand. Not wind, not fancy. They speak of hunger, of the earth's slow turning. The stones remember. He swallowed, the dryness in his throat acute. Further down, the entries grew more disjointed, more desperate. It demands. Not coin, not blood alone, but life. A thread from the lineage, woven into the soil itself. Great-grandfather Elara knew. He spoke of the pact, made generations ago, when the crops failed and the winter gnawed at their bones. A bargain for survival, for prosperity. A terrible price. Reid's breath hitched. A pact. A bargain. The words from the cabin's unseen resident. It wasn't just a burial ground, it was a sacrifice site, consecrated by his own ancestors. He continued, his eyes scanning rapidly, devouring each word. The entity is the land's memory, its hunger made manifest. It does not leave. It cannot. It is rooted here, deeper than any tree, older than any stone. The cabin is merely its hearth, the conduit through which the debt is collected. The family prospered, yes, but each generation pays a tithe, a life force drawn into the earth to appease the ancient hunger. My own health wanes. His relative hadn't died mysteriously, they had been taken. Consumed. And now, he was next in line. The lineage wasn't just a family tree, it was a harvest schedule. Then, a new name appeared, underlined several times, Granduncle Alastair. He was the one who kept meticulous records at the weather station. He believed the entity's cycles, its waking and dormancy, were tied to something more than just the moon. He tracked atmospheric pressures, geomagnetic shifts, even the subtle tremors of the Earth itself. He always said the true key lay not in prayer, but in observation, in understanding the land's language. His detailed logs, stored at the old weather station, might hold the pattern, the rhythm of its demands. He believed there was a way to predict, to understand the timing of the collection. Reid stared at the page, the name weather station stark against the faded paper. A jolt, not of fear, but of grim determination, shot through him. The entity was tied to the land, yes, an ancient, hungry thing. But if it had a rhythm, a pattern, then there was a chance. A slim, terrifying chance. The cabin was a tomb, but the weather station might hold the key to understanding the monster that guarded it. He had to go. The name weather station had burrowed into Reid's mind, a splinter of hope amidst the dread. He clutched the faded journal, its brittle pages whispering of a history he was only beginning to understand. The path to the station, according to the crude map, wound deeper into the forgotten forest, a trek he knew he couldn't postpone. The air inside the cabin felt thick, expectant, as if the very walls watched his resolve harden. He grabbed his worn backpack, a flashlight, and a small, rusted hatchet he'd found in the shed, a flimsy comfort against an unseen enemy. The forest swallowed him whole. Twisted branches, devoid of leaves even in the late season, clawed at the air, their skeletal fingers rattling in a wind that never quite reached the forest floor. The ground was a treacherous carpet of decaying leaves and exposed roots, each step a conscious effort. After what felt like hours, the trees began to thin, revealing a skeletal structure against the bruised twilight sky. The weather station. It stood on a slight rise, a rusting sentinel against the encroaching gloom. It was a utilitarian building, mostly metal, with a tall, skeletal antenna tower leaning precariously beside it. The wind, no longer muted by the trees, howled through the gaps, a mournful, drawn-out cry that seemed to mimic a human lament. Reid approached cautiously, his boots crunching on gravel long overgrown with weeds. The main door, a heavy sheet of rusted steel, hung ajar, groaning on a single hinge. This place had been abandoned for decades, left to the elements and whatever else might claim it. He pushed the door further open, the shriek of metal echoing into the vast emptiness. Broken instruments lay scattered across the floor, their dials frozen, their wires gnawed through. A large, complex console dominated one wall, its myriad buttons and switches caked in grime. He swept his flashlight beam across the room, the circle of light revealing rusted pipes, peeling paint, and the unsettling stillness of disuse. He began his search, his determination a brittle shield against the rising unease. He moved methodically, sifting through debris, prying open rusted lockers. Then, a sound. Not the wind, not the groaning metal. A soft, rhythmic thump-thump-thump, like a heavy heart beating in the walls. Reid froze, his flashlight beam steady, his breath catching in his throat. He listened, straining his ears. It stopped. He told himself it was the building settling, the wind playing tricks. But the stillness that followed felt too heavy, too deliberate. He continued his search, trying to ignore the prickle on his neck. He found a small, locked metal box beneath a collapsed workbench. With a surge of renewed hope, he used the hatchet to pry it open. Inside, nestled among desiccated papers, was another small, leather-bound book, identical in appearance to the one he carried, but thicker. As he did, the thumping returned, louder this time, resonating through the concrete floor beneath his feet. A low hum started, growing in intensity, vibrating through the metal walls, making his teeth ache. He could see his breath fogging in front of him. They weren't letters or numbers, but angular, disturbing glyphs that seemed to writhe and shift before his eyes, burning themselves into his retinas. Then, the door slammed shut with a deafening clang, shaking the entire structure. Reid spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was trapped. The air grew impossibly heavy, crushing down on him. It tightened, a suffocating embrace that stole his breath. You are mine now. His vision blurred, the room twisting and distorting. The walls seemed to breathe, the metal groaning like flesh. He fell to his knees, gasping for air that felt like ice in his lungs. This wasn't just a presence, it was a living, consuming force, and it was reaching for him, pulling him into its icy embrace. He could feel it trying to pry open his mind, to plant its tendrils deep within his thoughts. He scrabbled for the new journal, his fingers numb. He had to understand. He was trapped, yes, but he wouldn't break. Not yet. His breath hitched, a ragged sound torn from his throat. He'd fallen to his knees, not from weakness, but from an invisible force that had simply bent him, a hand of ice closing around his chest. This wasn't a haunting, it was a consumption. It wanted him, and it wasn't subtle anymore. He scrambled backward, away from the twisting floorboards, the blurred edges of the room. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the haze of terror. Now. There was no fighting this, no reasoning with it. This was an ancient hunger, and he was its next meal. Reid stumbled to his feet, his muscles screaming in protest. He grabbed the satchel he'd half-packed days ago, shoving in a few more essentials, a water bottle, a flashlight, the tattered map he'd found tucked into a drawer. His hands trembled so violently he fumbled with the clasp, the metal scraping against itself like a banshee's nail. He didn't bother with the truck, the keys had been missing for days, a cruel joke he now understood was no joke at all. He would walk. He would run. The front door, when he wrenched it open, offered no relief. It felt like stepping into an oven where the heat was made of cold. He plunged into the undergrowth, ignoring the branches that clawed at his face and clothes. He just needed to put distance between himself and the cabin, to escape its suffocating grasp. The path he thought he remembered, a faint trail leading south, quickly vanished. The trees seemed to shift, their gnarled trunks forming an ever-changing labyrinth. Disorientation set in quickly, a creeping fog that muddled his thoughts. He found himself walking in circles, recognizing the same moss-covered boulder, the same triple-trunked pine, over and over. Then, a flicker of memory. The map. He pulled it out, unfolded its brittle paper. Amidst the faded lines and forgotten names, a small, hand-drawn symbol caught his eye, a circle with 3 radiating lines, marking a structure deep in the woods, far from the main roads. Weather station. It was old, probably abandoned, but it represented a point, a destination, a chance. A place where there might be a radio, a phone, anything that connected him to the world beyond this cursed forest. It was a desperate gamble, but he had nothing left to lose. He pushed on, the map held tight in his sweating hand, trying to match the crude drawing to the impossible terrain. Hours bled into one another. His legs ached, his throat was raw, and his mind felt stretched thin, a fragile membrane about to tear. He swore he could hear a low hum, a deep vibration that resonated in his bones, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. A clearing. It stood like a derelict sentinel, its instruments, a wind vane, an anemometer, frozen in time, corroded and useless. The building itself was a small, square hut, its windows shattered, its door hanging ajar. Hope, a tiny, fragile flame, flickered within him. He stumbled towards it, calling out, though he knew it was futile. No one would be here. He pushed through the broken doorway, the sound of rotting wood tearing echoing in the stillness. He snatched up the top one, its cover brittle, its pages swollen and yellowed. The first few entries were mundane, detailing temperature and wind speed. But as he flipped further, his breath caught. The handwriting changed, becoming more erratic, the ink faded. The entries grew stranger, charting not just weather, but anomalies. September 14th, unnatural stillness. No wind, but trees. Sway. Humming. Feels. Watched. October 2nd, equipment failing. Readings erratic. Magnetic fluctuations. Not a storm. November 11th, the cabin. It calls. The relative is gone. The pact. It needs to be honored. Reid's vision blurred again, not from the entity this time, but from the sheer, crushing weight of the words. He recognized the handwriting. It was the relative's, the one who had died mysteriously. He continued flipping, his fingers trembling, until he found the final entry, scrawled across a full page, almost illegible, the lineage. The blood. It demands its due. A sacrifice. To bind it here, to keep the balance. But it's breaking through. The vessel is weak. It hungers. The forest. It watches. It guides. It traps. The final link must be severed, or it will consume everything. It wants the purity. The untainted. The heir. That was him. He was the purity, the untainted, the final link. The weather station, this supposed beacon of escape, was just another part of the trap. The forest hadn't conspired against him, it had guided him here, to this revelation. The entity didn't want him to simply die in the cabin. It wanted him to know why. To understand his role in the pact, in the lineage of sacrifice. He dropped the logbook. He was trapped. The cabin was a cage, the forest its walls, and this weather station, a desolate monument to a forgotten world, was just another cell. His attempts to escape, to fight, had led him only deeper into the maw. His mind, already frayed at the edges, began to unravel. He could feel it, the delicate threads snapping one by one, leaving him exposed, raw, utterly alone. It was here with him. It had always been here. And it was waiting for him to break completely. The wind, a mournful lament, clawed at the flimsy walls of the weather station. Reid stood inside, the air thick with the metallic tang of rust and the cloying sweetness of decay, a scent that had woven itself into the fabric of the cabin, and now, into his very being. He was the heir, the final link, the purity. The words echoed in his skull, cold and sharp as shards of ice. This place, once a distant promise of escape, now felt like the heart of the trap. The small, single-room structure was a relic, its purpose long forgotten by anyone but the forest. Rusted anemometers, their cups frozen in perpetual stillness, jutted from the roof. Inside, ancient, dust-shrouded dials and gauges lined a warped wooden console. A single, bare bulb, powered by some unseen generator, flickered weakly, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and shrank like grasping fingers. A faint hum, like a distant, dying bee, resonated beneath his palm. It wasn't coming from the console, but from within the very earth beneath the station. The floor, he realized, was not solid concrete, but a series of interlocking stone slabs, worn smooth with age, etched with symbols he'd seen before in the cabin, on the strange artifacts, in his nightmares. He knelt, tracing the lines with a trembling finger. They weren't random, they formed a labyrinthine pattern, spiraling inward to a central point. The air grew heavy, thick and resonant, as if the very molecules were vibrating with an ancient song. The flickering bulb dimmed, then flared with an unnatural intensity, bathing the room in a sickly, yellow glow. It wasn't a voice he heard, but a knowing, a deep, primal understanding that bypassed his ears and settled directly into the core of his consciousness. It was always here. The words weren't words, but a concept, a truth. The cabin, the forest, the family, they were merely recent additions to something infinitely older. This entity, this presence, was not a ghost or a demon in the common tongue. It was a hunger, a deep, foundational appetite of the earth itself, predating man, predating memory. It had slumbered, a vast, patient emptiness beneath the roots of the world, until a distant ancestor, desperate for prosperity, for safety, for a bounty the land refused to yield, had stumbled upon its awareness. A pact was made. Reid felt the details flood his mind, not as a story, but as a living memory. His ancestor, a man named Elias, had sought to tame the wild, unyielding forest. He had offered a bargain, a sliver of life for a harvest, a promise of peace for a claim on the land. And the entity, a vast, indifferent consciousness without malice or mercy, had accepted. It didn't demand blood, not initially. It demanded connection. The family became its anchor. The cabin, the strange artifacts, the unsettling phenomena, they were not manifestations of malevolence, but expressions of a deep, symbiotic relationship gone awry. The entity didn't want to destroy, it wanted to consume, to integrate, to draw the life force of its chosen line into its own, ensuring its continued presence in the world. The purity, the untainted, that was the key. Each generation, a member of the bloodline had been chosen, not necessarily for death, but for a profound, terrifying communion. They became conduits, their consciousness blurring with the entities, their life essence feeding its ancient hunger. Reid felt a profound revulsion, a sickness that churned in his gut. This wasn't a curse to be broken, but a bond to be fulfilled. And he was the next offering. The entity wasn't demanding his death, not directly. It wanted to absorb him, to merge, to make him another facet of its vast, ancient consciousness. It was a form of eternal life, perhaps, but one without individual will, without memory, without him. But then, another flicker of understanding, a different current in the flood of knowledge. There was another way. The pact had been made with life, but it could be severed with a different kind of offering. Not a life, but a severance. A complete, absolute rejection of the bond, a tearing away of the anchor. It would not appease the entity, it would starve it, but the cost. The cost was immense. It required not just his own rejection, but the complete erasure of the lineage, the severing of all ties. A sacrifice of identity, of history, of the very bloodline itself. To defeat it, to truly break free, meant to become nothing. To cease to be an heir, a descendant, a Reid. The hum intensified, vibrating through the stone floor, rattling the dust on the console. He saw glimpses of what it offered, an understanding of the forest, a timeless existence, a profound, terrifying peace. His very soul. He understood now. They were trying to claim him. And the weather station, this desolate outpost, was the altar where his choice would be made. To become nothing, or to become it. The cold certainty that had settled over Reid was both a burden and a strange kind of liberation. The entity wanted him, not dead, but assimilated. It was a subtle, insidious difference, a promise of twisted immortality that made his stomach clench. He had spent the last few hours poring over the tattered journals, the fragmented lore, and the cryptic etchings he'd found tucked away in the cabin's most forgotten corners. There was a way. A desperate, terrifying way, but a way nonetheless. It wasn't about sacrifice, not in the way his ancestors had understood it. It was about severance. His gaze fell upon a faded, hand-drawn map tucked into the spine of the oldest journal. A small, almost imperceptible mark, like a blister on the paper, indicated a spot a few miles deeper into the forest, a place labeled only as the Eye. He remembered a passing mention in a local history pamphlet about a rudimentary weather station established in the early 20th century by a reclusive forester, long since abandoned. The pieces clicked into place with a chilling finality. The forest seemed to hold its breath, watching. The path, barely discernible, wound deeper, the trees growing thicker, their branches knitting into a perpetual twilight canopy. It was the weather station. A collapsed anemometer lay half buried in the undergrowth, its delicate cups frozen in a final, futile spin. The small, shack-like building that had housed the instruments leaned precariously, its single window a gaping, toothless mouth. A low, mournful sigh of wind snaked through the broken panes, carrying the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and ancient, like dried blood. Reid pushed the sagging door open. It groaned, a sound like a dying animal, then fell inward, kicking up decades of dust. Moonlight, fractured by the grimy window, painted stripes across the floor, illuminating a single, sturdy wooden desk. On it, beneath a thick layer of dust and dried leaves that had blown in, was a metal box. Not rusted like the rest of the station, but blackened, almost volcanic in its texture. Its surface was etched with symbols Reid recognized from the cabin's carvings, symbols of binding and severing. He reached for it, his fingers tingling with an odd apprehension. The box was heavier than it looked, its weight solid and purposeful. He fumbled with the clasp, his heart hammering against his ribs. It clicked open with a sharp report that echoed in the tiny space. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like desiccated moss, was a single, obsidian shard. Beside it lay a scroll of parchment, brittle with age. Reid carefully unrolled it. The script, though faded, was legible. It was a first-hand account, penned by a distant ancestor, a forester who had lived over a century ago. The entity, a fragment of the land's primal consciousness, had been disturbed by the desecration of the burial ground. The ancestor, desperate to protect his family, had offered a binding, not a sacrifice. He believed he could contain it, feed it with minor offerings, keep it from lashing out. But the entity twisted the pact, slowly drawing the life force, the very will, from each generation, strengthening itself with every ancestor absorbed. The shard, the eye of the earth, was meant to be the key to its containment, a conduit to funnel its power back into the very earth it sprang from, severing its grasp on the bloodline. But it required a willing conduit, a final, deliberate act of rejection, not of death, but of absorption. Reid's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't about dying for his family. It was about choosing not to be absorbed, choosing to break the cycle by actively redirecting the entity's hunger back to its origin. He felt a surge of grim determination. He gripped the obsidian shard. The entity knew. It could feel his resolve, the shift in his understanding. When he reached the cabin, it was no longer just a house. It was a breathing, malevolent entity. The windows glowed with an internal, sickly green light. The logs of the walls seemed to ripple, expanding and contracting as if the structure itself was inhaling. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the ground, rising from beneath the floorboards, a sound that resonated deep in Reid's bones. He pushed the door open. It didn't resist. Instead, it swung inward with a silent, welcoming glide that was far more terrifying than any struggle. Inside, the air was a palpable weight, pressing down on him, stealing the breath from his lungs. The familiar interior was distorted, stretched, and warped. He knew, instinctively, this was where the burial ground's energy bled into the cabin, where the entity's hold was strongest. The air solidified around him. The temperature plummeted, and frost bloomed on the wooden beams overhead. It was the entity, fully manifested, its presence a crushing weight on his mind, trying to infiltrate his thoughts, to break his will. No, Reid gasped, staggering under the psychic assault. He fought back, clamping down on his thoughts, his determination a tiny, flickering flame against a hurricane. The pact wasn't for his death, but for his will. He would sever it. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but a heavy, suffocating blanket. Reid lay sprawled on the cabin floor, the obsidian shard still clutched in his numb fingers. His chest heaved, each breath a ragged tear through his lungs. The air, once thick with an unseen pressure, now felt thin, hollowed out, as if something vital had been ripped from its very fabric. A dull ache throbbed behind his eyes, a phantom echo of the searing pain that had consumed him moments before. The cabin was still. Unnaturally so. Yet, everything was profoundly different. It was like stepping out of a deep-sea dive, the pressure suddenly released, leaving his ears ringing with an unfamiliar emptiness. He stumbled to the hearth, the point where the confrontation had culminated. There was no charring, no physical trace of the struggle, only the lingering scent of ozone and something acrid, like burnt bone. Reid ran a hand over the cold stone, a tremor passing through him. Had he truly done it? The obsidian shard felt strangely inert now, just a sharp piece of rock. He let it fall from his fingers, clattering softly on the wooden floor. He needed to get out. The ancient trees, once menacing sentinels, now seemed merely old, their branches skeletal against the fading sky. His legs were leaden, his vision blurred at the edges. The forest floor, normally a treacherous tangle of roots and fallen branches, felt strangely yielding beneath his worn boots. He moved in a haze, each step a testament to sheer willpower. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time had lost all meaning. Then, through a break in the canopy, he saw it, a low, squat building, its corrugated metal roof a dull gleam in the gloom. The weather station. He pushed open the heavy door. It groaned, a long, drawn-out cry, and then swung inward to reveal a single, cavernous room. Desks were overturned, equipment rusted and broken, wires dangling like severed veins. A thin layer of grime coated everything, obscuring the faded charts on the walls. Reid sank onto a rickety chair, his head in his hands. He was alive. He had survived. But at what cost? A pang of fear shot through him. He could see them, yes, but there was a strange fuzziness around the edges, like a photograph bleached by too much sun. He tried to recall a specific memory, a shared joke, a touch, something deeply personal. He closed his eyes, focusing. His sister's laugh after he'd told her about the cabin, how ridiculous it all seemed. He could almost hear it, but then, a blankness. A smooth, featureless wall where the memory should have been. The tune was gone. The memory of her humming, the feeling it evoked, was erased. It wasn't just a few memories, it was a type of memory. The ones tied to deep emotional resonance, the intimate connections that defined his relationships. He stood and walked to a grimy window, peering out at the encroaching night. He had broken the cycle. He had redirected the entity. It had taken its tribute, a piece of his very essence, leaving behind a subtle, insidious scar. He survived, yes. The air, once thick with an unseen pressure, now felt thin, sterile, as if something vast and suffocating had been torn away, leaving behind a vacuum of exhausted quiet. He tasted dust and the metallic tang of fear, a phantom taste that clung to his tongue. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at the rough-hewn ceiling. The flickering light from the single oil lamp cast dancing shadows that no longer seemed malevolent, merely shadows. The cabin was still, utterly still. It was as if the ancient structure itself held its breath, waiting to see if the torment had truly passed. Reid slowly pushed himself upright, his muscles screaming in protest. He opened his hand, letting it fall with a dull clink onto the floorboards. It rolled a short distance, coming to rest against a loose plank. It held no power, no menace. The connection was severed, the conduit broken. Or perhaps, merely dormant. He looked around the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the familiar objects now imbued with new, terrible meaning. The old ledger, still open on the table, its faded ink revealing the desperate promises of his ancestors. His distant relative's death, sudden and brutal, was not an accident, but a final, failed payment. And he, Reid, had been next in line. He had faced it, whatever it was, the ancient, nameless entity that had woven itself into the fabric of his family's existence. He had, he believed, driven it back. He was no longer just Reid, the man who had inherited a cabin. He was a link in a chain, a keeper of a terrible secret. He spent the rest of the night in a strange limbo, too wired to sleep, too weary to move. He watched the first pale slivers of dawn bleed through the gaps in the window shutters, bathing the cabin in a gray, indifferent light. With the morning came a grim resolve. The cabin, for all its newfound quiet, was a tomb of memories, a monument to a horror he could not forget. He packed nothing. What could he take? His old clothes, a few books? They felt alien, irrelevant. He only retrieved his car keys from the hook by the door. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He walked, his steps heavy, his mind a maelstrom of images and sensations. The air, though crisp and cool, still carried the faint, earthy scent of decay, a reminder of what lay beneath. Hours passed. His legs ached, his throat was parched. He pushed through the tangled undergrowth, ignoring the scratches on his arms, the thorns that snagged his trousers. He needed to reach something, anything, that connected him to the world he once knew. Then, through a thinning of the trees, he saw it. A small, utilitarian structure, made of corrugated metal and faded paint, perched on a rise. A tall, slender mast rose from its roof, topped with spinning anemometers and a windsock that hung limp in the still air. It was a weather station, a lonely outpost of human endeavor in the heart of the wild. He stumbled towards it, the sight of its mundane instruments a strange comfort. He reached the small, padlocked door and leaned against the cool metal, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The dials on the external sensors were static, measuring temperatures and pressures that felt insignificant against the seismic shift within him. He traced a finger over the grimy surface of a barometer. It was a testament to order, to predictable patterns, to a world that now seemed impossibly naive. He knew he couldn't stay there. It offered no true refuge, only a brief pause. The world had changed, not just the forest, not just his family's history, but the very fabric of his understanding. He had seen the threads that connected the mundane to the monstrous, the living to the long dead. He had touched the ancient hunger, and it had touched his back. The scars were not visible, but they were etched deep into his psyche, a permanent alteration. Reid pushed away from the weather station, turning his face towards the unseen road. He was free, yes, but the freedom was a heavy burden. They were his truth, a truth he now carried, a truth that would forever shape his perception of the world.